Hey, guys!
Yes, Ben?
Due to a hilarious mishap involving a banana peel and a sharp blow to the head from a pineapple, I have amnesia.
Oh, no!
Oh, no!
Apparently, we're going to be running a podcast conference called Intelligent Speech on a thing called the Internet, but I don't remember anything about it. Could you bring me up to speed?
Oh, well, that seems like an unlikely conceit, but sure. Intelligent Speech is an online conference that connects thoughtful online content creators with their community in an intense one-day online event. This is our 5th year conducting the conference and our 4th running the conference online. Our event this year will be taking place November 4th from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. EST.
The conference is a 3-ring circus of content with around 24 hours of live presentations and roundtables happening in 4 digital rooms. Each session has 20 minutes of content and plenty of time for questions from the devoted audiences. There are also 3 keynote speakers: Sebastian Major of Our Fake History, Daniele Bolelli of History on Fire, and Rebecca Larson of Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Wow, that sounds intense. What if 2 people are like her presenting at the same time? Or I get a pie in the face and can't make it?
Well, good news. The entire event will be recorded for ticket holders to view later at their leisure. Wait, pie?
Hold on. A ticket. How do I get one of those?
Easy. Just go to our website at intelligentspeechonline.com, go to the tickets page, and buy a ticket today.
There's a link in the show notes, of course.
What?
The tickets are $30.
And even better, as a listener to this show, you will be able to get an additional 10% off by using the coupon code they will provide you in the show notes or in a minute. What an amazing deal!
Ben, was this just an elaborate ploy to get us to read an ad?
Quite likely. So go to intelligentspeechonline.com and get your ticket today. The host of this podcast will be there.
This week, instead of highlighting just one park, I thought I'd do a category. If there's one thing that has become clear to me, no matter how long I do this podcast, I will never get through all the parks and historic sites and preserves and trails. The National Park Service is one of those curious entities that has knowledge of the small and local, and yet encompasses a massive whole. So today I wanted to consider the sheer number of sites that feature the East Coast oyster. Not oysters the country over, and definitely no Caribbean oysters because no one has that kind of time for an introductory segment. Among other things, the National Park Service is working with a variety of agencies, organizations, and tribal groups to reestablish the oyster in its historical stomping, or at least clinging grounds. Part of that is reestablishing oyster banks. But another part is research on how indigenous groups were able to harvest thousands of pounds of oysters annually, and yet still maintain oyster populations so bountiful, colonists saw them as infinite. Oysters are part of the parks in the Big Cypress Preserve and the Everglades National Park in South Florida, Turtle Mound at Canaveral National Seashore in the middle, and Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve in the north end of Florida, which, technically Florida is not America yet in our current timeline, but there's also Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island in Georgia, where oyster shells are so plentiful they were used in the lime-based cement called tabby to build the town. National Park oyster-interested locations range from Cape Lookout in North Carolina and include any number of places along the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which touches on Delaware, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The Baltimore Museum of Industry is in a former oyster packing plant. Ellis Island, before becoming an immigrant processing station, was known as Oyster Island, as it was a place to haul up plenty of oysters for the city's voracious appetite. And then, of course, there's the Sagamore Hill site centered around the Theodore Roosevelt home that is located in Oyster Bay. Once you start looking, it becomes clear that almost any ocean-associated site under the aegis of the National Park Service on the East Coast is going to brush up against oysters. Because at the start of this country, oysters were everywhere. And this doesn't even begin to deal with the presence of oysters inland and how they influence life, which will have to wait. Because it's now time to get back to the main story. Welcome to episode 100. And this time it's Oysters for Action. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at what role oysters had in these years of war and discovery in very young America. While we now think of oysters as fancy food or, depending on your lights, kind of gross and something you can pass up easily, the oyster at the end of the 18th century was a food almost everyone had access to, and it was on the verge of becoming an even more common food in the next century. To get a better understanding of the oyster's role in these early unsettled years, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that even in these days of no refrigeration, is that oysters were still eaten raw. It's just that raw oysters never traveled very far from the waterfront. Like most shellfish, oysters can seal themselves up and get along for a bit out of the water. If they're kept cool and in a moist environment, say a barrel padded with kelp and filled in with seawater, they can bubble along for several hours or even a day or two. As a result, it was common for oyster sellers to set up along the docks or in small shops near the waterfront and sell shucked right in front of you oysters as street food. Further away from the water, oysters were eaten pickled, that is, stored in brine. These oysters were soaked to desalt them somewhat, then stewed and used in sauces, stews, and a few clever folks used them to make oyster ketchups. Oyster-flavored ketchup was, incidentally, one of the favorites, along with walnut and mushroom ketchup, before sugar became even more common and the tomato took over the country. But as with beef and such, drying oysters never really caught on. But that makes sense. Unlike the fatless muscle of the scallop or the sides of cod, oysters, tender and fatty as the edible parts are, don't take well to drying, especially in the generally moist climate of the East Coast. Some people will discover the pleasure of smoked oysters, and they will become especially popular later as canning takes off. But it's not a practical way to store oysters for the long term in these days of barrels, stoneware jars, and pouches made of cow stomachs and pig bladders. Which meant that while the oyster was becoming a fast food of the coastal cities, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Boston, Charleston, Savannah, and a barrel of pickled oysters was becoming a food to keep for winter meals in the pantry, the spring house, and the ice house. The oyster was not a food for war or adventure, except, of course, when it was. This is the thing about history and absolutes. There aren't any. Oh, okay, except for that one. There are no absolutes. The one place oysters show up in war and adventure is they are not just a fast food for the cities. They are a handy food for the soldier who finds himself on the coast, marching through rocky, sandy soil along the shore, or murky swamps pestered by mosquitoes and snakes has exactly one upside. That is, oyster beds or oyster banks. I've mentioned the absolutely dreary nature, not to mention the often missingness of the rations of the Continental soldiers. Foraging by these men, in both the Revolutionary War and later in the War of 1812, was a real part of how they ate and kept on their feet. But unlike back in the old country, which had a pretty decent sprinkling of villages, towns, and castle surrounds, full of well-established herds, orchards, and barns, the early American landscape was notably lacking in human establishments, rather barren outside of a few populated patches around ports. So it was common for men on the march to collect and consume oysters as they passed through the locales where oysters were to be found. For unlike fish or birds or game, all one needed to eat an oyster was a knife, which any soldier who still had boots possessed, along with a strong wrist and a modicum of skill. Now for us modern people unfamiliar with fresh oysters, hayricks, pitchforks, hatchets, twig brooms, and water buckets, we might find the prospect of popping oysters and slurping them down a bit daunting. But for people who did manual labor, men and women and children for hours on end daily, just to manufacture food to get it ready to eat, a snack that only required a good grip and a sure twist of a blade was most welcome. To be fair, they totally would have run any of us over for a bag of potato chips, and who knows what they would have done for a Hot Pocket. But an oyster was as close as they got to a meaty fast food snack, so really appreciated them when they came across them. Furthering this mirror opposite perception to what we have, for us, oysters seem relatively like a lot of work. We have to go to a special place that has fresh oysters, and then we have to dig out the oyster opening equipment. We have to recall or even learn the oyster opening skills, and that's an awful lot of food prep compared to, like our ordinary stuff. And then there's the shells. They have to be taken out of the house trash lickety-split, because fish trash gets extra stinky in our relatively warm, climate-controlled homes in unpleasant ways. It's the ammonia, But to our 18th century and slightly later people, lacking freezers, extensive countertops, and especially when foraging, entirely lacking butchers to prep the meat, an oyster, either raw or for the cooking pot, was among the simplest of all meat critters. I mean, think about it. Birds had to be gutted, and then their feathers all taken off, like pih, pih, pah. And then all those little bones. Sure, in songbirds and stuff that were real small, you just ate them. Crunchy. By the by, these little songbird bones and fish bones and stuff like potted fish and similar preparations, those were actually an important source of calcium in this limited milk world. And larger critters in the varmint category, go back to episode 39 for more details on varmints. They would have the bones and guts issue plus fur. I mean, it's not super hard to remove if you do it a lot, but it does take time, and it's just another step to bother with. And then with larger animals like deer, well, that becomes a bigger butchering job, and hunting deer takes time and skill and patience on top of all the butchering tasks. And just ask the Corps of Discovery group, getting an elk that you've shot back to camp, that's like a whole extra challenge. Just ask the long hunters of the growing frontier, those guys who went on these multi-month-long trips to collect a big old pile of buckskin. These dudes were regularly guilty of just taking a choice piece of the deer that they were killing because they had no way to preserve the whole thing. And then they just left the rest of the deer for wolves or even just bugs. Whole deer really need a whole group of people to deal with it properly to convert it into food. I mean, think about it. Why do you think modern hunters often take their deer to butcher shops to have them parted out and packaged? So men on the march in the largely squelchy, buggy, and generally unpleasant estuary locations where oysters would dwell, they could pluck up a few dozen large oysters or so and pop them into their packs. Laid by the evening fire, these oysters could be roasted or possibly popped into that night's stew. And at forts on islands where oysters were regularly taken from the tidal waters and eaten, the collected shells could even be burned to make lime, which would then be used to make tabby cement, to build walls and make repairs. And even if soldiers were unable to pick up oysters along a line of march, say, around the Chesapeake Basin or around the extensive estuary and harbor systems of Charleston, South Carolina, or the harbors of Boston or New York, many an enterprising merchant might definitely show up at established camps with a few barrels of oysters. In reenactments these days, we usually see baskets of cabbages and potatoes and corn, hardy greens, squash, and such, along with possibly haunches of livestock or deer. But never in these degenerate days do we see a barrel of oysters. Okay, fair enough. Largely because while oysters were literally lying on or just barely in the ground, free for anyone to pick up in the 18th century, these days, oysters are a pricey thing. Anywhere near concentrations of people, the wild oyster, just lying there to be picked up, is mostly gone. And if you do find oysters, they live defended by baskets and fences, where they are laboriously cultivated. And, possibly wisely, your average reenactor is likely hesitant to eat oysters that have been stored in the 18th century fashion, even if they were to have a taste for them. And the Revolutionary War was not the only conflict where the wild oyster made an appearance, for they fed soldiers during the War of 1812 as well. Now, it is true that much of the later war took place north and inland, or on the Great Lakes, where there are no oysters. Oh, yes, in the Great Lakes there are plenty of freshwater clams, and they will appear soon as buttons all over American clothes. But at the famous Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson's Kentucky Riflemen and Jean Lafitte's pirate irregulars coalesced to boot the British out of the Delta, inadequate provisioning prevailed. Just as with the Continental Army, getting the government to cough up funds for victualling the troops had been a challenge, and a challenge lost by the War Department more often than it was won. And even when monies were made available, finding suppliers who could and would supply what they promised in a timely manner, and at the places and in the amounts and at the quality promised, was almost always a futile exercise. So the warm water oyster of the Louisiana Gulf Coast would have added to the stew pots of the men as they converged on the city for the famous Battle of New Orleans, likely along with the odd turtle, catfish, rabbit, possum, and so on. Unlike rice last week, which was a new food or a mysterious fancy food to many Americans at the start of the 19th century, the oyster was familiar and generally beloved. Rice was spread around due to social classes crossing in wartime dining and a surplus of the unexportable grain. But oysters were a food all could share and enjoy no matter where on the social ladder they fell. An oyster stew or some oyster ketchup to add some oomph to a dish was appreciated by all. Then as now, other than how one holds their spoon, there's not much to separate how anyone consumes oyster stew. And in those rough and tumble days where men of scanty manners and reading ability started to be found within the halls of Congress, an uncouth grip on the spoon might be found just about anywhere. Now, for what it's worth, the grip of all four fingers around the stem of a spoon, much like one holds a hammer or a screwdriver is an item that was barely present in 1800, by the way, likely only found in America in a gunsmith or a clockmaker's shop. That would mark you out as something of a bumpkin or a ruffian in certain circles, but around a soldier's cookfire such a grip would not stand out. Oh, and all the members of the soldiers' camp, fighters, command staff, the campaign community, they would all have their own personal wooden or cow horn spoons. Cow horn might sound weird, but it was the plastic of the age, and so many spoons were molded out of it. But also in this age, in this baby America, there was the widespread development and use of more refined eating utensils, notably silverware, that brought out a different grip on spoons, at least for those in the know. How one held their spoon was part of that group of unspoken social cues that early America was putting in place to help define the classes in this supposedly classless society that totally had different social classes. All it didn't have was a technical legal nobility. So holding one's silver spoon, or pewter if one must, in a grip related to the way one held a pen that is balanced lightly between the first two fingers and anchored with the thumb, was a signal that one was literate and had been taught table manners by a mother or a sibling or a nursemaid who cared about such things. So sneakily, the consumption of oysters managed to give social cues. How you held your spoon eating oyster stew, even while oysters, both their access and enjoyment, they had no power as a social marker. But the manner in which one scooped up the oyster stew, well, that did mark you as one of us or one of them. Oysters were enjoyed by so many people so frequently and in so many ways, either fresh or pickled as location and time of year dictated, there really was no desire to make the oyster a symbol of the upper or middle or lower classes. Oysters were just there. So Americans, whether at peace or at war, up or down the social ladder, they absolutely ate them up. Now, next season, as we get out of war and back into kitchens, I will talk about how different preparations of oysters did start to divide along regional and class lines. But as far as I know, oysters and Tabasco sauce were definitely not yet a thing. And speaking of the entry of chili peppers into the American diet, it's time to start spilling the beans on the Big Easy. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803, right smack dab in everything that's going on here. Like I said, this period I'm covering is brimming with war and adventure. So join me next week for a little Louisiana and New Orleans history and how gumbo entered early America. Because it certainly did during this time. It just looked entirely different. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there, but even better than that, your reviews. Let people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least that you find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? Well, you can catch me and a whole gaggle of history podcasters on Saturday, November 4th at the Intelligent Speech Online Conference. Tickets are now available. See me live a few times, and you can even ask me questions. You can find this all at intelligentspeechonline.com, and the conference happens on Saturday, November 4th from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern. Come join us for absolutely hours of content. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prizefighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud. Well, okay, maybe straight up crime. Lots and lots of crime. We just wrapped up season 1 of the series Warrior on HBO and thoroughly covered Prizefighters and Gangsters. So now, to complete our title, we will walk through the historically creative movie The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman, Zendaya, and Zac Efron, and a CGI elephant. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THoAFood, because let's face it, I'm all X'd out. And all this info and a bit more is available in the show description.